Congress remains out on August recess, and the unfortunate reality is that most Americans could care less. Public approval of Congress remains below 30%, as most Americans have lost faith that the institution can accomplish much of anything. What can be done?
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is All Things with Kim Strassel.
Welcome to All Things with Kim Strassel, and this week, my guest is J.D. Rackey, Senior Policy Analyst at the Bipartisan Policy Center, who has made a study of what is wrong with Congress, both politically and procedurally, and what actions might be taken to, if not make Congress great again, at least make it minimally competent again. JD, thanks so much for joining us this week.
Hi, Kim. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So this is great timing. Congress will be coming back soon. And I'm so glad you're here because I recognize I'm a little bit of a nerd. I get really fascinated with this question of why institutions don't work. And I've been covering Congress for almost 30 years now. And to me, this has been one of the bigger issues in DC is Congress's growing dysfunction in almost every one of its core functions. It doesn't manage its most basic job of passing annual spending bills. It no longer conducts substantive oversight hearings. It does not engage in Senate House conference committees to reconcile differences in bills. It kind of just rubber stamps. They rubber stamp each other. It doesn't write detailed bills anymore, does not engage in bipartisan collaboration. The list is a bit endless. And I want to start with this, the big explanation we always hear as the cause for this, and I think it's a little too easy, is partisanship. And that certainly exists. But in my own view is that it's actually maybe a combination of both partisanship and then procedural and structural shifts in Congress that have fed the problem. Do you think that theory is right or wrong? What do you think leads to all this?
Yeah, so I think you're 100% correct that it is a multifaceted problem. Partisanship and polarization is certainly a big contributor to why Congress behaves the way it does. But the kind of under the surface explanation is that there has been a 25 to 30 year decline in Congress's own capacity to do its work. The congressional capacity has been stagnating or declining, depending on what aspect you're talking about. And it makes it difficult for Congress to execute on those constitutional functions and to keep up with an increasingly complex policymaking environment. I think the good news is, what I study is that Congress has been trying to do something to reverse these trends. Since 2019, there's been a bipartisan group of lawmakers engaged in systematic analysis of the operations of Capitol Hill, trying to find ways to make the institution more effective, efficient, and transparent.
Who are these lawmakers? What do they call themselves?
Yeah, so in 2019, Congress started the Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress, and it was a truly bipartisan committee. There were 6 Democrats and 6 Republicans. Bipartisan down the aisle. They operated with one staff. So rather than having a Republican staff and a Democratic staff, they had one staff that worked for everybody. I had the privilege of serving on that staff for a little bit. And we set out to kind of study the institution as what we called ourselves loving critics. We all know all of the problems with Congress, but we want it to function because that's the way it can best achieve its goals for the American people. That committee ended in 2022 and kind of took on a new form. It is now the Modernization and Innovation Subcommittee under the House Administration Committee, which continues to, work on implementing the recommendations of the Select Committee, of which there were over 200 of them. And then it continues to assess new issues that arise. So, for example, when I worked on the Select Committee, AI was not a thing. We didn't talk about it at all. So now the subcommittee is looking at how can Congress utilize AI to improve its own operations so that it can be more efficient and effective.
The only thing better than a politician, AI. Let's actually tackle this by kind of breaking this out into the two major roles that Congress sort of fulfills. I guess on one side, you'd call it its production side, which is actually a sort of constitutionally defined job of crafting and enacting laws. And then separately, we'll get to it, its oversight role. On the production side, the lawmaking side, let's divide that out too. There's probably no more basic job that Congress has than funding the government every year. And yet every year, nobody passes their appropriations bills. There are no conferences. We get continuing resolutions, omnibus bills, usually under some sort of government shutdown threat. We may well have one of those coming up in just a couple of weeks at the end of September. Part of this is polarization, but what else is going on when it comes to actually that basic job?
Yeah, so it's a little bit politics, it's a little bit process, right? On the process side, I think there's broad consensus that the appropriations process hasn't worked in a long time, if it ever really worked as intended. The last time all 12 annual appropriation bills were passed on time for the next fiscal year was 1996. And so I think there is an acknowledgement of that. Congress itself had a select committee looking at budget and appropriation process reform during the 115th Congress, trying to come up with ways to fix this problem. One of their solutions, which the Bipartisan Policy Center also supports, is shifting to a biannual budget and appropriations process, which would free up congressional work time so that they're not spending right now. Almost all of Congress's time is spent on appropriations. That's why it's in the news so much, because it's really hard to do appropriations. And so if you switch to a longer process, they could have time to do other things as well. It would also create more stable policymaking and allow for more assessment and better implementation of policy. If you're not constantly under the gun every year to kind of renew everything. But, as I said, it's not just a process function. The politics function is, congressional inaction and inability to meet deadlines is a result of there are many individuals, many factions, all within Congress that all disagree on many agenda items and spending priorities. And it is a genuinely monumental task to build a coalition that could enact those appropriation bills. And as you laid out, sometimes agreement just can't be reached. My friend Molly Reynolds at the Brookings Institute often says the rules are not magic, right? And so we can tweak processes to make them more efficient and to encourage the kind of lawmaking we want. But ultimately, this is Congress, just like all policymaking, is still a human function. And the members have to engage in those negotiations. And sometimes particularly in a divided era like we're in, it's really difficult.
Yeah. And, just that gets to the point so that listeners understand that appropriations are often tough because unlike reconciliation bills, they require 60 members to get them in the Senate, to get them across the line. And so you do usually have to have some buy-in from the other party. Right. And notably, we do manage to do that sometimes on important bills like, the National Defense Authorization Act, et cetera. But even now, those are sometimes more in doubt. Well, that leads me to another huge area. And it could be that your answer here will be the same, that this is more a function of polarization. But I think another huge American frustration, that was appropriations. But outside of that, on a policy front, it is simply the case that Congress does not do a lot anymore that is truly big from a bipartisan perspective. We do have these reconciliation bills that have become all the rage, but that's mostly because they can't come up with another forum for passing bills where they get 60 votes. I was actually thinking back through history, and again, I'm really old. I've done this a long time. I would argue that the last presidency where we really had some cooperation on bigger issues might have been the very beginning of the George W. Bush presidency. when in the wake of 9/11, we had the whole reorganization of the Homeland Security Department and other aspects of our national security apparatus. Also, the No Child Left Behind bill, which actually was cooperation between Democrats and Republicans. And I'm not saying we haven't had any policies since then. We, a couple of years ago, had bipartisan gun legislation, but not really like super huge stuff on big pressing questions. Is your answer to that the same, that this is just people have to get along, or is there anything that's standing in the way from a rules perspective from like the traditional kind of policymaking role?
Yeah, so I think a couple things. I think one, there's a lot more bipartisanship that happens in Congress than is often
Hmm.
seen by the public. 90% of everything that becomes law, it becomes law with bipartisan support, and so they are constantly working. While the floor of the House has operates mostly on a partisan basis, they also operate under the suspension calendar increasingly, which requires 2/3 support for legislation to move forward. And so there is stuff happening there. Also, you alluded to before, omnibus legislating and kind of these giant bills that combine a lot of different things. In those giant packages are a lot of policy provisions that have bipartisan support, even if the ultimate floor vote is along party lines. All of the work that goes into creating the legislative text often is still very bipartisan in fashion, working through the committee process. And both parties, no matter who's in the majority, that happens. I think to your other point, beyond polarization, there's not necessarily a procedural reason why some of these larger pieces of legislation aren't moving. But the other component is described in a great book by Francis Lee at Princeton. It's called Insecure Majorities. Is that for the past 30 years, increasingly, control of Congress is up for grabs. And that creates an environment where each party is incentivized to keep certain issues off the agenda for electoral purposes rather than policymaking purposes, because their goal before they can do any policymaking is to keep or win the majority, depending on what side they're on. And so that contributes to some of the policymaking agenda blocking, where things could probably get bipartisan support if a deal could be struck, but there are certain incentives to maybe not engage on those issues.
No, that's really fascinating. I'll have to go get that book, and I will. You just brought up something, though, that I was going to ask you about, because I think that there are sometimes changes. There are sort of ways in which the culture works in Washington that can actually contribute and make polarization worse in a way. And you just mentioned this, that a lot of these bills, if you look at the substance of them, a significant amount of it actually has bipartisan buy-in, especially if it was created at the committee level. Mm-hmm. But one of the complaints that I have heard a lot in the recent decade, in particular, especially from House members, but it also happens in the Senate, has been this trend, and it's happened in both parties, of top-down decision-making about the contours of final bills. Sometimes leaders just go into a back room and cook up legislation all on their own and then present it and expect their members to pass it as a kind of partisan duty. And, in those situations, the committees are playing no roles. And those committees, my understanding, is really where members from both parties get to know each other and work together and come to agreement on things. Is that been a shift in DC that has added to this problem of passage?
Yeah, I think that's true. To that point, the Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress made several recommendations to try to strengthen committees and re-incentivize bipartisan lawmaking in committees. Anything from having agenda setting retreats at the beginning of a Congress so the committees can decide what they're going to work on together, to adjusting the schedule for when members are in DC, how that operates, so that, if you ever watch a hearing, you see the members come in for 5 minutes, they give their spiel that
Yeah.
might be ended a question, and then they leave. And that is often portrayed as, well, members aren't interested in what's happening, or they have other things to do. It's truly a result of, they are supposed to be in 3, maybe 4 hearings all at the
Oh,
same
wow.
time.
Huh.
Through our analysis here at BPC, we found there's on average something like 10,000 scheduling conflicts for committee hearings every Congress. And so there are solutions that, if you deconflict the schedule, maybe they'll all sit in hearings together more and engage in discussion. If they were to adopt block scheduling and some other technology tools, so that they could actually spend time together in the policy environment. And then there's also more, I can describe it as feel-good recommendations that would encourage it. But we modeled it at the Modernization Committee. One is and this is probably better suited for subcommittees and smaller committees, but to not sit on the dais, and instead sit in a round table, and not sit split up by party. The idea being that, if you're ever in a meeting and you hear something interesting, your natural human inclination is to turn to the person next to you and chat to them about it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And our idea was, well, what if you're right now on the dais, you're turning to members of your own party all the time? So if you sit interspersed, you can turn and talk to someone else from the other party to get their perspective about whatever a witness is saying, in a less conflictual way, and one that allows kind of deeper policy conversation.
Yeah, I mean, look, that's an old tried and true. Dinner party hostesses will tell you from time immemorial, you don't let the married couple sit next to each other. You split people up around the table. And I've also been fascinated too that it does seem that some change has also been coming. Just the members, the rank and file, have grown a bit sick of this too. And if you think about it, some of the recent fights that House Republicans have had over their speakerships, which was painful to watch, but some of the discussions that were going on there around Mike Johnson and Kevin McCarthy was centered on demands that a lot of rank and file members had to reconsolidate some power back to the committee level and away from the leadership.
And I think it's important to take the long view here. Throughout congressional history, that pendulum between strong committees and strong party leaders is constantly swinging back and forth. Sometimes it swings back and forth relatively quickly within a 10-year period. Sometimes it's a 40 or 50-year period. And so that we've been in a 30-ish year period of strong leadership, particularly in the House. And so it's only natural that now we might start to hear some discussions about wanting the pendulum to swing back the other way.
Well, here's another one for you. And I know you've talked about this a lot and written about it. Another common culprit that people point to for why we don't get anything done, the Senate filibuster. Is the Senate filibuster the problem? That has certainly been the mantra recently on the left. Of course, it's a little bit of a different tune right now because they're back in the minority in the Senate. So now I think they're happy with the Senate filibuster again. But it is alarming in recent years and how quickly we had so many prominent elected Democrats in the Senate go on record saying that given the opportunity, they would outright abolish the filibuster so that they could pass anything they wanted with a 51 vote majority there. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think I'll return to my earlier quip was, the rules are not magic, right? The filibuster certainly has a very large impact on the policy making environment because its procedures are pretty massive in how they influence things. But we've seen, I don't know how unprecedented it is for as you put it, for a number of Democrats wanting to abolish it. The entire reconciliation process has, I think it's something like over 150 different carve-outs to the legislative filibuster. And so the Senate itself, and both parties have done this, have been slowly dismantling the ubiquitous power of the filibuster for 50 years or more. And I think there's also probably a misperception on just how many things are filibustered. There's pretty good evidence to suggest that not every bill that doesn't get a vote is the result of a filibuster. Not every piece of legislation that dies is not because of a filibuster. It's because there's lack of genuine policy support for an item. And so while we do know the rate of filibusters has increased, I think it's hard to determine just how universal it is as far as influencing things. That being said, having a supermajority threshold does incentivize bipartisan policymaking when there is policy action. So I think this is one of those things where, and I think this is why we haven't seen a lot of action on it, is it's really six in one hand, a half dozen in the other, as far as should we keep it, should we get rid of it, and what the results would be.
One more thing on this, because it does kind of touch on the filibuster, but its use in terms of nominations. You mentioned at the very beginning of this that part of the problem in Congress is a capacity problem. And I bring this up mostly in the context of the Senate, because we've obviously just been having this debate. President Trump was pressuring the Senate to stay in session the rest of the summer to make more progress on his nominations. And it is true, presidents of both parties have really struggled in recent history to get the people that they need in place quickly and get going on their agenda. And one of the problems here is this massive expansion in the number of positions that require Senate confirmation. I believe it's grown something like 70% from 1960 to recent times. And then also, it takes 4 times longer these days to confirm every nominee, in part because we've put so much emphasis on the advice part, the hearings, the investigations, the background checks, which can make it kind of hard to get to the consent part. Are there any talks about maybe changing all of that and having a good hard look at how many people need to be confirmed?
Yeah, I think you laid it out perfectly. And I have heard that there are discussions where people are trying to figure out what criteria could we set to maybe limit the number of positions that need advice and consent, to one, allow the president to more quickly fill important positions, but two, to make it a more manageable process for the Senate. The Senate doesn't like spending this much time on nominees, just as much as the president doesn't like doing it, right? And so I think there are things that could be, beyond reducing the number of positions, there are probably paperwork efficiencies and things like that, there have been nascent discussions for a while, but I think it's starting to come to a head of maybe we should get serious about reforming that. There is with all things reforming Congress, there is always a different things to weigh, right? So the pro would be your streamlining nominations, you're getting that through faster. A potential con, though, that would need to be weighed is senators of both parties like using the confirmation process as a way to conduct oversight of the executive branch and to get certain policy demands met. So if you reduce the number of positions that they have the ability to hold up or to not confirm, that could have a different backlash somewhere else. And so I think, with all things congressional reform, it's really important to think about, okay, we're focused in on this one policy area or this one procedural issue, but what downstream effects might it have?
Yeah. Well, and, I guess one other problem with getting reform done in Congress is that both sides are always thinking about how it could advantage or disadvantage them from a partisan
Right,
perspective.
right. There's always that.
Well, last question, just because I teed this up at the beginning. The other basic job of Congress is oversight. And I saw a really great interview you did just earlier this summer about the decline in oversight in Congress, both from the amount of oversight that we have, but also the quality of oversight that we have. Maybe walk us through that.
Sure. We were talking about the kind of atrophying of congressional committees earlier. And one of the ways they have atrophied is there's been a declining number of hearings and, more importantly, a declining number of witnesses at those hearings. And so we did an analysis here looking at legislative versus oversight hearings. And about the mid 70s, there was a switch from fewer legislative hearings to massive amounts of oversight hearings, trying to, be responsible for this new massive executive branch that had been created as a result of the New Deal and the Great Society. And over time, it's sort of decreased as maybe substantive policy making has taken a backseat to more messaging politics and partisan gotcha politics. And one consequence of that is that the witnesses that are being called before the oversight hearings that do exist are not the oversight experts. So the study we did here looked at how often Congress calls the GAO or inspector generals to testify before the committees to inform them about waste, fraud, and abuse that's happening in the executive branch. And we found just a sheer drop off a cliff of the number of those types of witnesses that are appearing. And in other research I've done, we also see a decline in the number of executive branch witnesses that are wanting to testify before Congress because no one wants to show up to be a partisan punching bag, right?
Yeah.
And so all of this results in kind of diminished substantive oversight of the executive branch because the people with all the knowledge about how programs are being run and things aren't being asked to come, and other types of witnesses are taking priority to serve Congress's other ends.
Well, JD, I could talk to you about this all day. And I wish we had more time. And by the way, as some of this was fascinating, I do hope that it gets more circulation. We hear more about some of this being enacted. I want to thank you for taking the time to come on this week. I want to thank our viewers and listeners. We are here every week if you want to tune in. If you like the show, please hit the subscribe button. And if you'd like to write to us, you can at atkim@allthings.com.